With the days getting shorter and rain is pattering against the windows more often, autumn is coming around, and so is the desire to create a dress fitting the witchy season that is starting again. This time we will be looking more detailed into the process of creating a new pattern out of an existing one, sewing different mock-ups, and the work with tulle and the play with the transparency of this fabric. Grab yourself a cup of tea and sew with me the black tulle skeleton. The first thing I ask myself when starting a new project is if I already have a pattern that can serve as the basis for the new dress, or if I need to construct something from scratch. In this case, I found a pattern in my stash that I had drafted a few months ago, which would work as a base for the new pattern. It didn't have the seams in the right places, but the silhouette of the pattern was very close to the new design, which is why it was a good starting point. So I chose to sew this pattern from a test fabric and then see what I can use from it. The old pattern had both the high collar and the flared hips, which I was able to adopt for the new dress. Thus, I only had to transfer the lines of the new design to the old cut and directly had the rough proportions correct. I still changed a few things on the first test piece that I could already see should be different on the pattern. After that, I cut the mock-up into its new determined parts and transferred them onto paper. Usually I like to trace the pattern rough with pencil and draw over it with a dark marker. Because of the dark lines on the pattern paper, I can simply lay the mock-up fabric on top of the pattern and trace over it. This way I don't need any pins, which means the fabric doesn't make these small bulks and the pattern will be the most accurate. When sewing a mock-up, I want to make it as precise as possible, since only that guarantees a fitting pattern. For this, I am cutting exactly 1 cm seam allowance, sew at 1 cm and then give the seams a good press so that they are as accurate as possible. This mock-up is now the first with the correct lines. Fine details on the silhouette, for example, can now be adjusted to it. Especially at the swing of the hips, the shape has also changed due to the rearranging of the seams, which can now be adjusted again. These corrections are then transferred to the pattern. After this step, I usually transfer the pattern from one large sheet to several pattern pieces, so that I can then continue working with them. With these pattern pieces I made a third mock-up to make sure the whole construction looks smoothly and how I imagined it. I actually had to work on some of the pattern pieces a bit more, cut them again from fabric and exchanged them on the mock-up. After I was completely satisfied with the look of the test piece, I could use it as a base to draw the positioning of the boning on. The last step of the mock-up process was then to cut the test piece open and transfer all the lines onto the pattern. Some days I'm lucky and the first test piece directly works perfect, but more often it is a process with several mock-ups in which I get closer to the design I have in my head with every piece I sew. Whichever way it is, having a pattern you can be sure is perfectly constructed makes all following steps much easier. The idea for this dress came to me when I read the comments on my latest video. Many of you said that the under construction alone could be its own dress and wanted to know more about the construction of it. So, let's see how such a dress could look. This time I used black tulle as the see-through fabric and some black boning I still had laying around. The boning is a bit softer, but since it will be on the whole dress, this may be more comfortable than stiffer one. Working with the tulle, I first figured out how many layers I wanted to make the dress see-through, but still showing the black. Since the tulle is more stretchy in one direction, I used an equal amount of layers in different directions to prevent the tulle from stretching too much. After ironing the tulle, I pinned it to my ironing board and laid the pattern pieces underneath. This way the tulle wouldn't move and I could see the pattern through it. I then traced the lines with basting thread onto the tulle. I traced the outside of the pattern as well as all the lines where I wanted to sew the boning on. This took basically forever, but was a very calming task. Removing all the pins, I could then cut out all the pattern pieces. I didn't edit a specific seam allowance and just estimated it because I could see the basting lines of both pieces while sewing, so I didn't need the seam allowance to match. I then sewed the pieces together, pressed the seams open and then cut away the seam allowance as much as possible. On top of these seams I then added the boning. I had to figure out the order in which I closed the seams and added the boning beforehand, since some parts had to be sewn before others in order for the pattern to work out in the end. Some of the boning that wasn't straight had to be ironed in the right shape to create smooth lines. With every seam that was closed or boning that was sewn on, I could then remove the basting threads underneath. After sewing the whole bodice, I could then add the tulle skirt to it. The tulle skirt is made of different tulle layers gathered at the top and sewn together. I wanted it to have a bit of volume at the top but not too much, so I added it in 2 steps. The first skirt part was simply laid over the bodice and sewn onto it by hand. It was made of a few different dense layers. The second part was a single layer, gathered separately with a wide stitch and marked with the safety pins at the front and sides. It was then laid over the bodice the other way around as the layer underneath. After matching the safety pins with the side and front of the bodice, I pinned down the middle of each section as well and then pulled at one thread to gather the skirt. I made sure to divide the gathering evenly and then sewed the skirt to the bodice. Having the whole outside ready, it was then time to sew the lining dress for the inside. Since the bodice and also the skirt are fairly transparent, I decided on sewing a simple inside dress. I still had a grey stretch fabric in my stash that would work well for the dress, which was planned with an invisible zipper in the back. The neckline matched one of the boning lines on the outer dress, which would later be used to secure both dresses together. Since it was a very easy pattern where I needed every piece to be cut out 4 times, I made templates from a thicker paper to trace the pattern onto the fabric. I've quickly sewn the inner and outer layer and then added a strip of interfacing to the neckline to make sure it wouldn't lose its shape due to the stretch of the fabric. With both layers sewn, I then cut out a waistband, secured it with interfacing as well and added my label to the one that would later be on the inside of the dress. After that, I cut out a circle skirt from the rest fabric. This was a bit difficult since I had just enough fabric to puzzle it together, but it worked out in the end. I then added the skirt to one of the top layers, added the zipper and sewed everything together. The last step was then to hand sew the waistband of the inner layer to the outer one, as well as to the zipper. After that, the lining dress was ready to be sewn into the bodice. For this, I simply pinned the grey dress to the bodice along the neckline and sewed it on by hand. I left out a few centimeters in the back to leave enough space to close the dress later. whole dress now needed a closure, and I went with the lacing going down at the back from the neck to the waist, since it reminded me a bit of a spine. And with that, the black tulle skeleton dress is finished. I loved creating this dress, especially because the idea for it came from the dialogue with you, which I think is amazing. I'm so happy how it turned out, and I think it totally fits the witchy autumn vibe I wanted it to. What do you think?